raise those big questions. Can the Quad really contain China? Has the rise of Quad or the emergence of Quad unnerved China in any way? Are Russia and China now coming closer together and forming a front? Joining me now, Navtej Sarna, former ambassador of India to the United States. Einar Tangen is American-Chinese political and economic affairs based in Beijing. Richard Rossow, senior advisor and Wadhwani chair in US-India policy studies, joins me from Washington. Appreciate all of you joining us. He's at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Navtej Sarna, to you first. What's your sense? There are two views emerging from the Quad. One is that it sent out a strong message to China and Russia. The other is that they've stopped short of naming these two countries, and therefore there is still concern as to just how far can the Quad actually go in reining in either China or Russia at the moment.
Thank you, Rajdeep. Thank you for having me on the show. I would tend to go with the first view because the second view is already accepted form. We've already reached a situation in which when India is part of statements, we don't really criticize Russia by name, and we go by the standard generic formulations regarding territorial integrity, sovereignty, humanitarian assistance. That is the common ground that can be agreed upon. And as far as China is concerned, Quad has never really openly put out that it is a gathering against China. You will notice the word inclusive comes everywhere. And the fact that anybody who really plays by the rules that these countries are sort of agreed upon with each other can theoretically join. So China has not been named in any statement, so I don't give much credence to the fact. There's a lot of shorthand about China there. There's a lot of proxy naming of China that is there in the statements. And that is being read by the Chinese as well. You would have seen Wang Yi's reactions, where they say these are small circles and they are the new Cold War, the Asian NATO, and all that sort of stuff. So I would tend to go with the first one, that this is a strong meeting. It's a strong messaging, particularly to China, I would say, because it is being held in the Indo-Pacific. Now, there was a fear that the United States would get so bogged down with Ukraine and Russia that they would lose interest in the Quad and in the Indo-Pacific. Now, this meeting has put that fear to rest, and there's a strong messaging on several things, a kind of taking forward the agenda of the Quad as a constructive agenda, as a positive agenda, and as something which is, giving it practical shape.
I'm going to come to the specifics of the Quad to you, Mr. Sarna, in a moment, but let Mr. Tangen respond to that. The fact that you're saying that China is the elephant in the room, let's be very clear. Even though they're not named, this alliance is broadly seen, certainly by the Chinese, Mr. Tangen, as being anti-China. Is that how it's perceived, particularly because of Mr. Joe Biden, the US President's statement yesterday that if Taiwan was to be attacked, the US would and Japan would intervene. How is that being seen in Beijing? Is this being seen as an anti-China alliance being forged?
Well, of course it has. I mean, that's one of the reasons I enjoyed my colleague. And he said that he was very dismissive, that, Wang Yi was claiming this was against China. And then in the second half of his answer, he said, obviously, this was aimed at China because it was held in the East. Yeah, of course, China is concerned, and justly so. I mean, the situation in Ukraine, from their perspective, was the U.S. knowingly pushed in and created Ukraine into a proxy state to create a war for PR purposes initially. Now they see that the Ukrainians are resisting, and they're saying, oh, gee, this works out well. And obviously, Beijing is concerned that they're going to try to do the same thing with Taiwan, especially in view of Biden's third slip of the tongue, which is always being walked back by his advisors, saying, oh, no, we've not departed from strategic ambiguity or anything like that, or he just said it off the cuff. Well, he said it 3 times in as many months. At some point, you have to believe him.
So when you say that the Chinese are they concerned about it? Do they see the forging of the strengthening of Quad as an attempt specifically to contain China? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, they're obviously concerned if four of your people or four powerful countries get together and basically draw a bullseye on you. I think India would be concerned about something like that. Obviously, they have to do it. But when you start looking at what actually happened, most of it was a talk shop. They talked about $50 billion, a one-time investment into infrastructure and green and this. I didn't really identify how it was going to be raised or what projects would be funded. China, on the other hand, just through the Belt and Road Initiative, each year puts in about 60 billion. So, I mean, China sees this as kind of minor attempts to kind of convince nations that they're doing something. Go back to the ASEAN meeting in Washington. Biden promised $150 million for 10 nations to do all sorts of wonderful things. It was a slap in the face. They just didn't know what to make of it. Plus, he didn't even bother to have one-on-one meetings with these leaders who had come all the way to Washington. Unfortunately, Biden, he has a lot of rhetoric, most of it aimed at the domestic side, as his poll numbers flag, but it doesn't seem to be having a clear strategy.
Mr. Rossow, you've heard two views there. What's your sense? Is this an Asian NATO in the making, as Navtej Sarna seems to suggest, or some analysts would seem to suggest, or do you believe it's a talk shop, as Mr. Tangen suggests, that really, at the end of the day, doesn't add up to much? What really is the Quad all about?
I'd say it's a talk shop today that hopes to evolve into something that will be a more defined and proactive security partnership in the future. But these are four countries that don't have a long history, at least together, of working together. So they're starting on smaller things, which I think we'd all sort of agree. China's domination of global trade flows in areas like critical minerals, a lot of the infrastructure money that was discussed before. We've seen that used as a hook for political leverage with a number of countries in the region. Although sometimes that money that China deploys is also used on commercial basis, but there are times when it's been used as a more of a hook for countries where they want to get deeper security ties themselves. So you see, the evolution from strategic issues, I think, so far that have been at the crux of strategic and commercial, critical minerals, therapies, and healthcare, things like that. But then this time you saw, I think, a new step in a different direction, using somewhat ambiguous language, but talking about, deepening cooperation on humanitarian disaster relief, saying civilian-led, but utilizing military assets when needed. And then second, I think the biggest announcement was this creation of this Indo-Pacific partnership for maritime domain awareness. This will become real the day they decide to press button here. We've got 4 information fusion centers tracking ship movements across the region, and the ability to get them to begin sharing information on an unclassified basis. That can start pretty soon. So you did see some elements, I think, in this that begin to move it away from simply being a talk shop and beginning to define. But it's young, so we'll see where it translates into in the future.
There's one view, as I said, which is the talk shop view, Navtej Sarna. The other view also is that, what really can this group do to contain China? India's had to deal with 4 Chinese aggressions in the last decade, 2013, 2014, 2017, 2020. Quad has been around. What has the Quad been really able to do? Can the Quad really send out a strong message to China? It couldn't send out a message, just like NATO. It couldn't eventually contain the Russian aggression in Ukraine. If the Chinese were to be the aggressor on territory, whether in Japan, whether in the Solomon Islands in the context of Australia, or dare I say in India, what can the Quad really do?
But Rajdeep, first let me correct. At no stage did I say that this is an Asian NATO.
Right.
I said the Chinese seem to dismiss the Quad as
point
Asian
taken.
NATO.
Yes.
As to what we can do, a lot of the caution, and India is the most cautious of the 4 countries, has been due to the fact that you don't want to push the Chinese beyond a point. What you're trying to do is to bring an alternative paradigm, an alternative economic paradigm, and increasingly an alternative technological paradigm available to the countries of the Indo-Pacific and to all of us, honestly, so that you can counter the Chinese aggression, quote unquote, and I don't mean it only in military terms, the Chinese aggression that is taking over country in terms of technological backbone and predatory economics and so on. And therefore, the military security aspect of this is an important part. For instance, India and US are increasingly comfortable exercising with each other. There is the AUKUS, which is partly overlapping the Quad, and so on. But that's not the only thing. And that is why a lot of others, India has been particularly conscious of underlining things like climate change, infrastructure, technology, the Quad fellowships, education, and so on, so that we don't turn it entirely into a military security kind of gathering. And the announcement at this meeting of the IPEF, even though it's very early days on
the economic framework.
It's the economic framework, it's very early days on that, but it shows that yes, there is some sort of a plan to align policies, to work together, to provide these alternative paradigms.
You know, it's interesting you're saying that, because at one level, Mr. Sarna, we are part of BRICS, where China is part of this coalition that we've forged, and we are part of Quad. You think both can be reconciled?
Well, so far so good, Rajdeep. And, you know, India has the ability, I think, and the nimbleness to work its way through these organizations and through these multilateral bespoke forums, as I call them, in order to push its own self-interests. Obviously, this is not easy, because as you see, the three other countries of Quad are very critical of Russia, but we are not. And yet we have managed to reach a joint statement. So there must be something right we are doing.
Mr. Tangen, how do you see it? You know, where India at one level has this strong trade relationship with China, at another level seems to want to build some kind of a Indo-Pacific alliance that is aimed at containing China with the United States. Do you believe the two will be reconciled, can be reconciled from a Chinese perspective?
No, I mean, there's a basic hypocrisy. I mean, and I caught a little bit in my my former colleague's statement, and he talked first about principles, about how important that is, and then he finished up with self-interest. I think at some point you have to reconcile those before you start talking about, you know, threading the needle. We can do this, we can do that, but then clothing it in some sort of higher principles. That's something that the U.S. has done. They talk about the rule of law, but I don't think that the people in Afghanistan would agree with you, or Iraq, or Syria, or Yemen, or many other places, including Africa, South America, basically. But
Mr. Tangen, I'm sorry to intervene. I mean, Chinese expansionism is also a reality. You know, let's be clear. Chinese expansionism is also a reality. Why should we not have a free and open Indo-Pacific?
Okay, so at what point has China ever prevented any kind of traffic through the Indo-Pacific? This is a myth. The fact is that 40% of China's GDP depends on ships going through this Indo-Pacific region. Why would they cut it off? This is something the U.S. says it's possible. Yes, everything's possible, but it's not probable. Why would China commit suicide by ending the trade routes that bring raw materials to China and ship out finished goods to other nations? It's a trading nation. What you talk about in terms of this aggression is simply the fact that China is the #1 trade partner for 120 countries. That is not by coercion. That is simply by mutual benefit. So this idea that everyone likes to say that there's some sort of big plan that China wants to take over the world, it's not justified in history, and it's certainly not justified by the facts.
Mr. Rossow, is that an exaggeration, a Washington exaggeration about the Chinese threat? The Chinese have in return turned out to suggest that the US wants to make Asia-Pacific countries pawns in US hegemony. Is the US exaggerating the Chinese threat at Quad, or do you believe it's a real threat to the region?
Well, there's three domains where, you know, the previous speaker clearly, you know, is kind of ignoring the facts that everybody in India knows so well. India today has lost a couple hundred square miles of territory due to Chinese incursion. You see every day as well, and we've got satellite imagery showing aplenty, that Bhutan is slowly being engulfed. Nepal has faced a lot of the same kind of pressures. And across the South China Sea, when you see Chinese fishing boats turning off transponders, cutting off Philippines fishermen, China signing on for UNCLOS and ignoring a dispute, settling an island dispute with Philippines. So there are areas. I mean, it's not to say the United States foreign policy has been perfect throughout time in history, but to ignore, what we've got, satellite imagery, treaties to which China is bound and ignored decisions and rulings, it's very laughable, I think, to say that there's been a perfect run from the Chinese side as well. So India looks at these things and says, we need help and protection. The fights that India sees happening in the South China Sea, the aggressive expansionism, the 9-dash line, the creation of artificial islands, the utilization of merchant marines to harass fishing vessels and cover islands of neighboring countries. This is all quite real, and India is concerned, of course, that you're going to see a lot of these same fights played out in the Indian Ocean in the future. And India has enjoyed a long history of being the dominant naval power there. But if China looks to move a carrier in there, friendly ports that they're helping to co-develop right now, partnerships are going to be important. And clearly the United States and Australia can be two terrific allies in that.
You go along with that, Mr. Sarna, that this is the first stage towards an eventual broader alliance, which will at least send a message to the Chinese when it comes to Chinese expansionism. Do you really see this as some kind of a deterrent alliance?
Well, it may not deter the Chinese, but you just can't lie down and take it. And I'm afraid the speaker who came after me and who said that India and said that India is indulging in hypocrisy and said that China wants free trade and free movement. I'm sure he's heard of places like Habantota and Somalia and Gwadar and how much free trade is going to be allowed and how much the trade and militarization of these ports and other ports is happening, and the creation of islands in the South and East China Sea and so on and so forth. So this may not be a deterrent, but this is an important coming together of four countries which can actually formulate and project a different kind of leadership, a different kind of economic cooperation, and very important, something which, a free technological atmosphere, because technology is going to be crucial in the economic cooperation in the years to come. An alternative digital landscape has to be provided to these countries. Otherwise, we may all give up. That's all. So I think it's a tremendously important thing. It's moving very cautiously. It's growing slowly, bit by bit. And as long as the four countries are aligned in their broad perspectives, not in all details, and they are aligned towards what they see as the danger coming from China, I think we'll move together. Maybe in baby steps, but certainly forward.
Well, that really, in a sense, perhaps sums up the Quad. Baby steps being taken, but hopefully moving in the right direction to forge the kind of alliances that are needed in the 21st century. How Beijing will respond in the weeks and months ahead, we'll have to wait and see. But for now, to Mr. Rossow, Mr. Tangen and Navtej Sarna, appreciate your joining me here on my top talking point tonight on what the Quad message really is.